And here comes the screen in 3, 2, and 1. All right, I'm on the air. You should be seeing my screen now. It'll say Seim Effects, Tools and Tips for the Photographer. That's on my desktop background. And just shout out in the chat room. Please let me know if you're seeing the screen so I don't get started without people seeing that screen. Good? Coming through? Excellent. I don't know what resolution it's coming through because I'm actually working on a 30-inch cinema display, so I've got about 2500 by 1600 coming out of this screen, and I'm wondering how it's scaling it down, but it seems to be coming through nicely, so that's the way we like to hear it. Okay. Oopsies. Get rid of that. Okay, so let's jump right in. Let me hide the chat window. 1920 by 1200 coming through nicely. Excellent. And what I'm going to do is jump right in to Lightroom. So I think a lot of you were here last week. If not, just kind of a recap of what we covered last week. We discussed the basics of importing the images, getting them into Lightroom, how to deal with, you know, the basic interface, the grid, the import. We talked a little bit about the grid edit and kind of doing those basic edits, starting on a whole group of images with a general purpose Lightroom preset like Super Simple or Superhero or something you've made or got somewhere else, whatever it is that works for you, but getting yourself a foundation point to start with. And then we went into doing the grid edit in terms of, before you get into that develop module, sorting those images down 3, 4, 5 stars, that kind of thing, however works for your mind, for your workflow, getting your images sorted so you're not working on images that you don't need, and then getting into doing that grid edit, selecting small groups of images individually as you scan through in a grid, and use the quick develop up here to go through and quickly adjust exposure and contrast and stuff like that, and get the general tone of all your photographs looking exactly the way you want them. So that was, you know, the essentials of Lightroom Essentials that we did last week. And let's this week get into a few more deeper things, and then also get into some development and stuff like that. So folders, collections, and virtual copies. There's a few things you need to know, and if there's Aperture users out there in the crowd, it does work differently than Aperture. In my opinion, it works better than Aperture in terms of the simplicity once you get your head around it. And if you look up here, last week we also talked about the catalog, and up here is the catalog. And what we see in this catalog is kind of an overview of the catalog. All photographs is everything in this catalog. So right now, I'm in a collection. If I click all photographs, it's going to show me everything that's in the entire catalog. Now, I can still filter down here, stars, all that kind of stuff, search for things, all the good stuff that goes along with working in Lightroom. But that's a quick way to see all the photographs. But effectively, here's everything. Quick collection is if I was going through and I use the B key, which should be on the list, and you can add it to a quick collection. So a quick collection is great if you're going through and you're doing like a client proofing or something like that, and you want to mark ones that, you know, maybe this is being used in the album, or this is going into a folio, or they're making a print of this one. Now, you can also make collections as you go along, but the quick collection is always there. You just press the B key, and boom, you're in the quick collection. Just going to pop in here and there and check the chat room as we go along. Make sure everybody's in order. Everything's looking good. Okay, so what happens down here next? We get into the folders. Now, in Lightroom, when you look at folders, it's talking about a folder for real. And this is a confusion. This is a confusion that I had when I started learning Aperture, because I was, you know, getting into Aperture and wanting to get my head around that. I made a pack of Lightroom presets for it, all this kind of stuff, and there was some confusion there. And I won't go into how Aperture works, because that's not how what this is about today. But in Lightroom, when it says a folder, it means literally. So it's actually saying pending to. That's the drive. This is my pending hard drive that it's on. It's in pending to, images. You know, here's the subfolders that are in there. So if I go here and look on my desktop, you know, here is pending to. It's a real physical hard drive. So forgive me if I'm repetitious, because I want to make sure I knock these things home, because if you get all this stuff really through your head and you don't forget it, it's going to make it immensely easier in terms of keeping track with what you're doing and how you're managing your images. So a folder is a real folder. So if I go to here And let's look at this. Let's say I take this, and here's a photo. This is actually when I just got back from day. This is a 300 megapixel scan from a 4x5 view camera, and it's not the greatest photo. It has some issues, but it's a really good experiment for me. I've been doing a lot of testing in terms of resolution and stuff for my large prints. Again, another topic for another day, but I get excited. Okay, so let's say I was going to go here, and it's in this folder. It's in IQ and detail work. So bear in mind, when you're within a folder, you can select and see and narrow down to within folders just like you would if you were browsing your hard drive on Mac or PC, wherever you were at. The folders work the same in that sense. If I click a folder here, it takes me and shows me just that's in this folder. Remember that no matter where you're at, the filters and things like that, filter by 4-star and higher, let's say. All that stuff still works. Okay, I'm going to turn off those filters. The folder is just a way to select what group of images. If I selected the main one, it will be the equivalent of selecting all photographs, because in this case, that's the only folder in here. So you can have as many folders as you want. You can have as many drives as you want. And let me just collapse this. If I had a big catalog with a whole bunch of different drives, I don't like to work that way. As we talked about last week, I like everything in one place because there's an organization there. But if I had all this stuff on separate drives, it would show as different drives. And then each drive, you would be able to expand and see what folders are inside that. So let's go back to this folder. And let's right-click. If I right-click on this image, I can say Show in Finder. Now, on a PC, this would be something like Show in Windows Explorer or something like that. It's going to take me to that file, and we see that this is exactly where it says it is. It's in Pending to My Projects, Test Catalog, Images, IQ, and Detail Work. And there's this file right here. It's 1.84 gigabytes, and exactly the same as where this folder. I know I'm getting redundant. Again, like I say, I'm just trying to make sure we're clear on this. So just go back here. So these are your physical files. Now let's go on to something different. That's one way to organize. This would be the traditional way to organize in that we're used to making folders. Here's Jack and Jill's wedding. Here is Bobby's birthday. Now, here's the balance. For me, I like folders, but for example, in my shoots catalog, I make a folder for each year. I say, this is 2010, this is 2011. And I do back it up, but if something happened to a catalog or if I needed to access them from somewhere else, I have a general idea, even if I'm not in Lightroom, how to get to those photos because they're organized by year, which isn't that many photos in terms of browsing through on a computer. It's a lot, but it gives me a semblance of order without getting carried away. Because the thing is, if you make folders for everything, I no longer go in and make a folder and say, okay, this is 2010, this is Saturday's photo walk, this is Sunday's photo walk, this is Monday's trip to Mount Rainier, this is Sunday's family reunion. I don't make a folder for everything. If it's a major event, for example, when I go on the road for a month, I make a folder inside 2011 that's called Spring Trip. So I can kind of subcategorize a little bit. And if you look through folders, you'll see that I have a couple different folders in this one. So you can have subfolders and all that just as you normally would. Now, also just to be clear, if you click this plus sign up here, and this is similar in a lot of areas throughout Lightroom for adding things, you can add a folder or a subfolder. So I could click on Images here and add a folder and just call it, oopsies, I'm zoomed in, and it would actually open up and allow me to create this folder. I'm sorry, I'm getting confused. I'm telling you that wrong. Scratch that. If I still add a folder, it allows me to add a new folder to Lightroom. So rather than import, like we talked about that last week, I could actually go in and say, okay, take everything inside this folder right here and add it to this Lightroom catalog. And then I would have a new folder added in here, not images, it would be Mitchell's senior portraits or whatever it was that I selected. So that can be done from right here. Now, if you want to add a subfolder, you can actually create a folder. So let's say, and that's what I was getting at that I screwed up. Right now I'm in the images folder still. Adding a subfolder, let's try this, and let's not include any photos. Create. Okay. Now let's go and look. Show in Finder. I'm going to look at this file in the Finder so I can see the actual images. And see, I actually made a physical folder on the hard drive called Gavin Sub. Now, I'm not going to put anything in it. I just wanted to make sure we're clear on that. So I'm going to go ahead and remove this. And it is a little confusing they have it set up in that Here you can add a folder of images, and here you add a subfolder to the catalog, and you can choose to put images in it if you want. Whereas the other one is effectively an import, but not using the same approach. Okay. To those on the control panel, if you just got here, I put a couple links in there. I know a couple of latecomers are rolling in. And head over to seimfx.com/chat. That's where the buzz is going on. That's where you can talk. Of course, you can ask questions and stuff in the GoToWebinar interface right here. But head over to seimfx.com/chat for the general chat. And there's also tips and stuff over there if you're having any technical issues, and some tips on how to use the interface and all that kind of stuff for the webinar in case you want to ask a question or raise your hand. Okay, so we're looking at folders. Let's look now at collections and kind of tie all this together. So we've clarified, and I think I've hit this plenty of times, a folder in Lightroom is a real folder on your computer. Okay, now what happens if I'm in a collection? Let's go to Quickfolio, just a little portfolio of images. Okay, so here is a collection. Now let's right-click on one of these images. Let me make these thumbnails a little larger since you guys are probably seeing it a little smaller than I am. We'll fill up this screen. Okay, I'm going to right-click and say Show in Finder like we talked about a minute ago. And where is this? This image is in Images, IQ, and Detail Work. It's right here. It's also down here. Why is that? Okay, so a collection is not a folder. A collection, kind of think of it as a folder that's only specific to Lightroom. So it doesn't move the original file. It doesn't change the original file. A collection is adding it to a group within Lightroom. It doesn't make a copy of the file. It's the same image. So if I were to click here, see this is selected. If I were to go and click back to the actual physical folder, IQ and Detail Work, it would still be selected because it's the exact same image. If I change this, okay, and I do 2 stops over exposure, which is going to be terrible on this, but let's say I did that, okay? Now I go back to that Quickfolio. It's exactly the same. It's the exact same file that we're working on. Okay, now let me get that back because I can't stand to look at that image done that way. Shift-Command-R. That's in the shortcuts list too, so you can, great one to remember for resetting. I was just editing a wedding today, and I cannot stress enough remember how important it is to remember the essential shortcuts, because I had done my sorting, my initial preset. I had done the grid edit like we talked about last week, and effectively I was doing kind of a more extended grid edit using a little bit of the develop module, and taking a group of photos, editing them, adding some presets, changing white balance, and I was copy and pasting things around to different photos and groups as I went down through this list of 400, 500, 600 photos that I was keeping to put together for their album. And it's so fast if you have those shortcuts. You can sit there and just kind of bounce your fingers around and move around, select things with the mouse, know those shortcuts. If you have to read them every night, 3 times a night for the next year, remember the basic shortcuts like copy, Shift-Command-C for copy and develop settings, paste, Shift-Command-V, switching modules like grid, G is the G key, D is the develop key. Remember those shortcuts. I'm getting them a little bit off track, but I'm going to keep hammering this shortcuts thing because the shortcuts are really powerful and really important. Just checking the questions. Everything's looking okay. Let me know if you have any questions, so I'll keep an eye on that. Okay, so in a collection, let's make a collection and make sure we understand. I'm going to minimize these ones here. And I'm going to take some photos. Ah, there's my lid off. Not mine, but okay. Go to collection, and again, I'm going to click this plus sign right here. Okay? And I'm going to say, here's some options. I can create a collection. I can create a smart collection, and we'll come to that. And I can create a collection set, which is what you see here. It's like a group of collections, and I can expand it like this. That's a collection set right there. So in this case, I'm just going to create a collection. It's going to pop up this window, and let's call this Test Collection. All right? And I can either include selected photos or not. and I can also make virtual copies. I'm not going to because I'm going to come to that in a minute. That's what's next on the list. Okay, so creating a collection. Boom. Okay, it just switched to this collection. I'm now in the view of this collection. And there it is. Now, if I went back to here, let's say I was anywhere in Lightroom, and I selected some photos and dragged them in, you can just drag photos into a collection. So maybe you got a project you're working on and you just want to add images, and you see the number down here increasing. It's 11 now if I add images. And at any time, I can go click on this collection, and here's everything in this collection. And of course, filtering and all that kind of stuff still works if you're in a collection. Stacks don't work the same. You can't group images and do a stack within a collection. So in that sense, it's a little different than a folder. But everything else on a basic sense works the same. I mean, I could still go in. I still got my quick develop. I could do a grid edit from collection if for some reason I had put my pics into a collection. So a collection is a group referencing the original files that are in folders. And we see we kind of have these in order here. Here's folders, here's collections. So you can work from either one. If you need to get to images and you know where they are and you say, hey, I want to go to the photos for June of 2010, you can go to the folders and browse and go to June of 2010. On the other hand, you might make a collection for June of 2010. However works for you and whatever is the best for your brain, that's how you want to roll. Just get yourself a system and stick with it. Chat room's a little quiet. Is everybody hearing okay? And does anybody have any questions? Just take a little 30-second break here. Make sure everything's coming across okay. Is everyone out there? There it is. Okay, just making sure. I don't want to be sitting here talking to nowhere. Sounds good, Al. Okay, I'm going to continue. We're going to finish this first segment, and then I want you guys to, if there's any questions at all that come up, I want you to throw them out there. If in any way you're not fully understanding what we're dealing with. Okay, so now what's a smart collection? Let's look at that. So we created a collection and put images in it. Okay, let's go and make a smart collection. And smart collections are really cool. I'll be honest, I don't use them a lot because I use the separate catalog method that we talked about last week, and I don't have a huge need for them. But the larger a catalog gets, the more powerful I could see a smart collection being, and especially my shoots catalog where I put my stock images and stuff that I make. As that grows, that could be a huge resource for doing this sort of thing. So let's just title this. And in this sense, it already works. I'm going to make it a cooler title. I am smart. Wow, that didn't really ring true. MSART. Okay. Now I'm not going to fix it. Okay, so name your smart collection. You can put it inside a group if you want. That was the collection sets that we talked about right over here. Okay? But the cool thing about a smart collection is you can define whatever parameter you want. You don't drag any photos into a smart collection. It adds photos dynamically and automatically depending on what you want. So let's say, and this works similar if you use iTunes and iPhones and all that kind of stuff like I do, there's smart playlists in there. And you can define playlists based on the parameters of a file. That's really what we're doing here. So I can say, and choose a parameter. Let's say I want ISO speed rating. Is not, is greater than. So we're defining these ifs and ands or buts. Is less than. Let's say ISO speed rating is 3200. Match all of the following rules. Okay? So in this case, I could add another rule if I wanted to. And what that would mean is ISO speed rating is ISO 3200, and the rating is greater than or equal to 3 stars. Okay, now I've got a second parameter. You can do as many of these as you want. And these are really cool. So, and it could be keywords. I mean, look at all the options. It could be searchable text, keywords, file names, copy names, camera type, lens. I mean, you could break this up as much as you stinking wanted. And it's awesome. Okay, now all means all these parameters have to be met for it to work. Any means any one of these parameters would have to be met. So generally, you would have it on all. And none, not really sure what the point of that would be. But It's there if you want it. Okay, so I'm going to leave all checked and create a collection. Boom. I'm not even sure what's going to be in here. Okay, so here are images, all of which are 3-star or greater, all of which were shot at ISO 3200. Voila. And the 5D Mark II does great at ISO levels, so these actually look pretty decent. Some random stuff in here. This must be from the wedding test folder. A lot of these are unprocessed, but you get the idea. So we could go back now, and we've made this smart collection, and we can do whatever we want with it. Yeah, smart collections are cool, Matthew. They're really cool. So I'm going to edit the smart collection. Boom. And I can go in and redefine these parameters to whatever I want them to be. So now I'm going to change this speed rating to 1600. And I'm going to make it 5 stars or higher. Click Save. And the image is just completely changed. I didn't have to drop a single image in. I just completely redefined the parameters of the search. And you can do this for anything you want. It's very cool. I think you get the idea. Now, of course, you can still move collections around. Let me get in close here and show you this. Internally, collections do work kind of like folders, and that, you know, for example, I could drag. Let's make a collection set and call this set 1. Okay, so here's a collection set, which is like a box for all the collections to go in, and I can drag collections into that, and that way I can collapse them and hide them and all that kind of stuff. Okay. So I'll leave those for now in case we need them in the questions. But I think that covers the essentials of collections, except for virtual copies. I'm going to resize this window. I need to be able to check into the chat, but I don't want to obliterate everything on the screen. There we go. Yeah, this is on the Mac Pro, and it's a few years old. It's a dual-core Xeon Mac Pro, and I would love to get something a little upgraded because, as I've talked about, my files are getting larger. I actually just imported that 300 megapixel 4x5 scan in before I started the workshop, and it's having some issues. Lightroom will handle it, which is good to see, but that's a very large file to be working with. So it might be time for a new Mac Pro, but one thing at a time. I better do a couple more workshops so I can pay the rent first. Okay, so before we wrap up the collections topic, real quick, let's talk about virtual copies. For this, I'm going to start back in a folder. So I'm just going to go to this folder, and let me just narrow down, get rid of some of these. So I'm going to filter to 5 stars or higher. Okay, so here's an image that this was shot at ISO 25000. And the reason I noted it is because I did some work on it, and I wanted to get the stars without the streaks, and I was really happy with how clean of an image I actually managed to get, considering it was ISO 25000. And you're not seeing the full detail because it's still loading the preview. Just so you know what the image is. Now, let's say I wanted to do something with this image different. Maybe I want to make a version of it in black and white, okay? It is very grainy. I mean, it is ISO 25000. Let me go back to the grid with the G key. I'm going to go Command, quotation mark on the keyboard. And I just made a virtual copy. Now, I could also have done that by right-clicking and saying Create Virtual Copy. But again, I have to set an example here of using shortcuts. Okay. Hey, I see we've got 1 or 2 more in the webinar there that have popped in a little late, but head over to the link there, seimeffects.com/chat. It's in the messages down there in your control panel, and that's where the chatter's going on, and all that good stuff. You can ask questions in this panel, but head over to that chat room and join in. Okay, so we've just made a virtual copy of this. Now, here's what this is. If I go here and show this in Finder, it's showing me the original file. A virtual copy is not making a copy of the file. And that's what's cool, is I could go in, and let me just go to the develop module. We haven't got there yet, and we'll get there in a few minutes. But let me just take this in to the develop module. Okay. And it's loading. And loading. Okay, and loading. Come on, please load. Please load. There it is. Okay, perfect. So let's say I wanted to convert this to black and white. I'm in Power Workflow, and I'm going to go to one of the black and white presets, and just black and white XI. Okay, I'm going to convert this to black and white. And excuse the delay. Okay, there we go. Now, it's not a great black and white. It needs some more work, but you get the idea. I'm going to go back to the grid mode with the G key. And gosh, it is running a little slow. There it is. Okay. Those thumbs a bit bigger. We didn't change the original at all. So what we have here is a raw file, and Lightroom hasn't changed the original raw file. It's just changed in Lightroom. So Lightroom has done a virtual change to the original file we imported. Then we made a virtual copy of the raw file, which means it's not a physical copy. It's only within Lightroom. And we made more changes, and that didn't even change the changes that we didn't make to the first file. Now, I know that's terribly confusing, and that's why I'm just trying to make sure that we're clear on this. This first one we imported, we made edits to. And if I, click this exposure, we talked about how last week, if I change this, it's not changing the original file until I export, which we'll come back to later. Okay? But when I make a virtual copy, I can make 100 of these. So let's say I went like this, and I selected all these images, and we saw that when we made a collection. Let's make a new collection. We'll call it a V collection. And we'll say make new virtual copies and create. Now remember earlier when I did a collection and I went into the collection and I said if I change this photo in the collection and then go back to the folder it came out of, it's going to be exactly the same. Well, that's no longer true. So let me just go up here and I'm going to apply a quick black and white like super satin or something like that. There we go, super satin. Okay, so right to this image right here. Okay, I just converted it to black and white. Now let's do what we did earlier. Let's go back to the same folder. And voila, we didn't change the raw file I've imported, not even in Lightroom. We only changed the virtual copy. Cool thing about virtual copies is they take up virtually no space. So let me first quantify by saying I'm not a fan of like doing a wedding and doing a photo and say, okay, here's a selective color, here's a black and white, and here's a faded color, and here's a regular one. Don't put that in your client's hands. It shows, in my opinion, it shows a lack of decisiveness and professionalism if you can't decide how to make a photo. But a virtual copy is really handy because sometimes you need to have a variation of that photo for something. I mean, who knows what your project is? Virtual copies are really very cool and give you a lot of power. Now, let's just go back to here. Here's this virtual collection. And this is just a collection. I could drag non-virtual copies into this as well. But at the moment, this is all virtual copies. And just to be clear, the way you identify a virtual copy quicker is it has this little turned up corner at the bottom. An original file will never have that. That's only a virtual copy thing. So look for that turned up page corner, and that represents a virtual copy at a glance. Because it's not actually changing the file name. Because it's basing this virtual copy, even though we've made changes to it in Lightroom, it's based on the original raw file sitting on your hard drive somewhere. If you export this, it's not /virtual copy, it's whatever file name you set it's set to, or whatever parameter you set when you export. But if I go in here and I delete that virtual copy we made, okay? Boom. Now go back to this folder. And it's still there. Why is that? Okay, so when you delete something from a collection, you're not deleting a file. Whoopsies, my mistake. Okay, if I hit delete, I'm removing them from a collection. I'm not deleting the file. The same goes for original files. If I take this out of this collection, it's not letting me delete a photo from a collection. And the reason it's giving me that error you just saw there is because I was in a collection set. I need to go directly into the collection, but still, I can't delete a photo. I can only remove it. Okay? And just to be clear what just happened there, the reason it wouldn't let me delete it from here either, it didn't let me delete it for a set. I was confusing myself because I was moving too fast. It didn't let me delete it from a set because you can't delete even the image from a collection if it's in a set. You have to go directly to the collection to remove images from that collection so it knows where you're taking the photos out of. And you can't delete from a smart collection because a smart collection you don't add photos to. A smart collection is defined by the parameters you set. So if you want to remove photos from a collection, you change the parameters. Excuse me, a smart collection. If I go to the non-smart collection, and I'm sorry, this is getting a little too confusing, but I'm trying to make sure it's as clear as possible. So I'll take some questions on this. If I delete it from a smart collection, bear in mind, it is not deleting the original file. It's just deleting from the collection itself. Same with this here, the virtual copies. Okay? So if I go back to here, we still have all these virtual copies, which now I got to go back later and get rid of. And I can't remember the shortcut. I think there is a shortcut that you can delete. I should know that right now. I'll try and check that on the break. But to delete groups of images where you're actually removing them from Lightroom via a collection. But the regular delete key will not. Normally, if I was in a folder and I hit delete, it would say, what do you want to do with this folder? We talked about this last week. It would allow me to remove it from Lightroom or delete it completely from the disk. In a collection, delete means you're removing it from the collection. Okay, so where are we here? Perfect. Okay, next on the list is Develop Essentials. Let's just do an overview real quick, and then I want you guys to ask your questions on this because I know it can get a little confusing. That's why I'm spending some time on this, and I was being a little too confusing there in a couple spots. So our folders are physical. Those are actual locations on the hard drive where our images are stored, and we can sort and view images by that. Our collections are virtual. They're located within Lightroom only, and they don't make copies of the files. Even if you make a virtual copy in a collection, like this guy right here, it's still not duplicating the file, it's only within Lightroom. So just to be clear, the separation, if I right now deleted this Lightroom catalog, I would have all of these folders still, and all these images would still be on my hard drive. I would not have any virtual copies or collections, because those are part of the Lightroom catalog. Okay, questions. Let's jump in here and talk a little bit more about collections, catalogs, and if anybody has anything that I was overly confusing on or that you're not fully understanding, shout out now. And you can put it in the chat room. I'm watching the chat room. You can also jump on the audio feed, jumping in there and raising your hand. I know somebody out there has a question. Correct, Al. You cannot delete from a smart collection. A smart collection is parameters. And that's why, for a second, I was confusing myself because I didn't realize what collection I had selected. If I try and delete a photo, it's not letting me do it. From a regular collection, you can delete. Just bear in mind, it's not deleting the photo, as in the physical photo. It's not even deleting a virtual copy if you've set it as such. It's just removing it from the collection. Anybody else? If nobody has questions, I will move on, but yes, a collection is a pointer to the originals. Exactly, very well put. And a virtual copy points to the original, but it doesn't change the original. So that part's a little confusing, but not quite so much as you think when you start using it. It's referencing the information in the original file, but it's not making a physical copy of the file. So what's cool is you might have a 30 meg file or a 50 meg or a 100 meg file, and when you make a virtual copy, that might only take like 5 kilobytes on your hard disk, because essentially it's text. It's just part of the Lightroom catalog. It's saying, here's a virtual duplicate of this, and here's the changes that have been made. Yeah, the originals don't get touched, whether it's a virtual copy or a original file. It always leaves those original files on the hard disk alone. Yes, and a virtual copy does... Oh, exactly, Matthew. Any edits that are currently done when you make a virtual copy are going to be mimicked. Yeah, so if you did, Kelvin, and we'll look at that later. We'll do 2 versions. But let's say I made a virtual copy of this, and I made one that had, was super dark like this right here, and I exported both. It would export both, and it would give it separate file names on export. because it can't overwrite the same file name. So it would have, image 1, image 2 kind of thing. It would do a sequence. But it would export both versions. So to Lightroom, when you're working to Lightroom, a virtual copy is a real image. It's part of the catalog, and in your mind, yes, it's a virtual copy, but to Lightroom, it responds in every way like editing a real photograph. If that makes sense. Advantages. Daniel says, are there any advantages of using collections versus filtering in the folder with stars or flags? Yes, I think there are. And for example, you see here let's look at what I've done here. I mean, I have collections. This is a test catalog I use for training. So I have folders, and actually I have more folders than I would normally have in a catalog because I'm keeping it split up into different things, different topics I discuss in different workshops. So here's a general folder. Here's folder for EQ when I'm discussing dynamic range. Here's HDR, IQ and detail work, all this different stuff. Excuse me, those are in the folders. So I keep that element of organization so that when I'm exporting, for example, I can go directly into a folder and not even have to open this catalog. But the collections, I do more organization. I have all these sub areas, and sometimes I get a little redundant in folders versus this, but I have way more sets in here. Like, for example, this here is 3 minutes with color fantasies. It's a demo I do sometimes, and these are all virtual copies of the original. And what it is it's a demonstration of what I did in 3 minutes using color fantasies presets and all the different variations of this same photo, some of which are ugly because every preset is not suited to every photo. But it was a demonstration. So I don't need a folder for this. I couldn't even have a folder for this because they're virtual copies. So collections are extremely relevant if you want a group of virtual copies. Let's say you want to edit it one way and then edit something another way and you want a whole group done that way. But collections are also relevant for further organization. So for example, let's say this was a portrait job. I would go in and edit all their photos, and then I might say, okay, here's the main folder of Matthew Senior portraits. And I might be able to click that and see all the images. But then I would also, when I was done, a lot of times I'll say, okay, here's my 3-star and higher. This is what I'm going to show them when they come to proof. I would go and make a collection and make a proof collection. Because the reason I started doing that is I often found that when I was proofing, I would say, okay, here's all images, rate by 3 stars. And during the course of it, somewhere the rating would get removed, or I would change something, and suddenly they would see all 600 images instead of all 60 images, and all the bad ones. And it's right for somebody to say, oh, wait, what's that? And you're like, oh, that's the one that's out of focus that I didn't want them to see. I mean, there's some images that the client never should see. So not only for organization, but it keeps me tidy. If I make a proof collection and have it right down here, that's where I do my proofing from, and I can still filter, I can still organize, but I don't have to worry about showing images that I didn't mean to show. Also, I'll make a collection, and we're going to talk about this on the Lightroom Businessman, which is in 3 or 4 weeks. But when I'm proofing and projecting, let's say they say, hey, I want a 30-inch print, I'll make a collection and just call it 30-inch print, so I can quickly come back and know exactly what it is I need to make. Just looking at the chat room here for questions. Al says, Gavin, how anal are you about keywording as another way to sort down the road? I'm very poor at keywording, and I probably should be better. Here's the thing. For a portrait job, and we talked about the separate catalogs last week, I think keywording is pointless there. Well, I shouldn't say pointless. It depends on what you're doing with the images. But if I'm doing a portrait or a wedding, I don't need to keyword it Jack and Jill's wedding. I know it's Jack and Jill's wedding. If I have that catalog open, that's where I'm at. Now, in something like this, or in my main catalog, for example, where I have stock and stuff like that, those I do keyword. And I'm not anal about it, but, if I go to export an image, because I'm going to try and submit it to iStock Photo or something like that, I don't have a lot there, but let's say I'm doing that, I'll keyword it in Lightroom because I learned it's way faster. Not only are the keywords there, it exports the photo with the keywords and the metadata when I export. So now I upload it to iStock, it picks up the keywords, it loads them up. Flickr can work the same way. when you upload it. So it is beneficial to keyword because you keyword your original and then everything you export is keyworded. Same with adding like your copyright metadata. Now every copy you export has that copyright metadata. So I think it depends on what you're doing with them. Keywording is very relevant, and it just depends on what you're doing. And we'll get into more keywording stuff. I think, can't remember which workshop we're talking more about keywording, but we will get into that too because there's some cool stuff you can do there. Okay, any more questions or shall we move on? I don't want to get stuck too long on this. Is everybody clear about the essentials of folders versus collections versus virtual copies? Did I cover it well enough? I don't see any boos, so I'll take that as a yes and move on. Okay. Now we're going to get into Develop Module Essentials and the power of presets. And we're going to kind of bundle that into one. I want to make sure we're moving through, but it's kind of in the same area, really. So let's say we have general tests. And I'm going to sort these oldest to newest. Okay. Just going to take all images. Oopsies, now I messed it up. I'm undecisive. I'm just trying to pick a photo. Okay, let's take this. Here's a raw file. And I hit spacebar. I'm still in the library mode. Now we're going to go into the develop mode. D key will take us right there. So the develop module, this is where the magic happens. And you can do so much to a photo this way. And this is where Lightroom does 95% of what Photoshop does 5 times faster. Because on the right side, you have develop settings. And on the left side, you have management and workflow. It's all right here. So we're going to just work on this image for now from Yosemite. And we talked last week about the grid edit and all that kind of stuff. And this image, you know, the exposure is fairly good. I mean, I exposed for the highlights and nothing's blown out. Up here in the top right is our histogram. Very valuable. So I can actually mouse over that histogram and it'll show me any areas that are clipping highlights. The right of a histogram is highlights, so I'm clipping some highlights over here, and the left is shadows that I'm clipping. I'm clipping a few shadows down at the bottom. You see that purple highlight coming up. So that's really handy. Histogram is also just a great way. Learn to read your histograms, guys, because if you understand the essence of what you're looking at in your image, I mean, I can usually, knowing the scene I just photographed and glancing at the histogram on my camera screen, I can know if I did it right for the most part. Very powerful. We won't go into how to use a histogram here because if you do a Google search, there's lots of info on how to use a histogram. It's not terribly complicated. But our histogram has some real wide dynamic range here. There's a lot of shadows and a lot of highlights in this scene, but we can work with that. So what I would do is to start with, I would get a starting point. Now, if this was a wedding or something like that, I would have done a batch import. I don't always follow that grid edit precisely if I just have 4 or 5 or 6 images from a shoot, from like a nature walk or something like that. Typically, if I'm not doing fine art, I'm very careful about my exposures, and I'm not taking a lot of photos. I don't come home with hundreds of images from an afternoon or a sunrise walk or something like that, particularly with 4x5 because it costs me so much. So, you know, I might be adding some vignettes or doing whatever. I will start by playing around with presets. Here's the thing. With presets, we get a huge amount of variety that we wouldn't get over here in the develop module because you simply don't have time. You're not going to try 200 different variations of this and mixing channels different ways and doing all this different stuff to figure out exactly how you want this. So what you do is you go through and you have presets. And this here is my Power Workflow 3 presets. That's my most popular collection. I also have, just a quick plug, is the Color Fantasies and the black and white presets, which is Silver Shadows. Those are the Lightroom preset collections. Now, Power Workflow has a little bit of everything, and probably most of you watching this already have Power Workflow. But I can go through and just try different things. You know, the polarizer will darken my skies down a little bit. And I can just mix it up and see what I might like to do. This is actually kind of cool. I don't know if I want a faded look on this, but it's different. And what's happening is here is I don't have to love all these exactly as they are. This is actually looking pretty good. Oftentimes on a portrait or a wedding or something like that, all except your very best images, you'll apply a preset and that'll be it. It'll look good and you'll just leave it where it is. And maybe the best ones you'll go in and you'll manually tweak or something like that. For my best of the best, my fine art type work, I usually am doing manually tweaking. But generally, I'm starting with a preset to get me started. Let's say I want to do a black and white and go for that rich look. I would just go down and I would start experimenting with different black and whites and seeing how they affected this image. The thing is, what we have in the develop module, which we're going to start looking at in brief in a minute, there's so many subtle variations, there's so many different ways that you can process and mix channels that it's literally infinite. It's infinite in practical sense, I guess. Maybe I shouldn't say it's literally infinite. But you see how all these different variations we're getting of this same image by clicking different presets. So what you got to do is, hopefully you've kind of visualized and you have a vision of where you want to go with this image, and you'll probably have a place to start already. Let's go back to the original RAW. But let's say we're going to do a black and white. So I'm going to go down to the Silver Shadows presets, which are all black and white, and I'll just go through until I find something that I kind of like in terms of black and white. And if we look up here, we're seeing an instant preview to give us an idea of what that preset's going to look like. That's really handy too. And Lightroom is really good on this. Aperture is really slow on its rendering of presets, and it kind of drives me nuts, and previews and things like that. Lightroom is generally pretty instantaneous, and I really like that because you can really see what you're about to do to a photograph. So what I'm doing is kind of looking for a general look that's working for me, and it's not that critical, I guess. I'm just going to pick one. Okay. So here's this black and white preset. This is what we've done to it. Just checking the chat room real quick. Al says, how does your edit history look after clicking all the presets? I assume that only the final one and the edits you make is the set that will export. So if I go up here, let's look at the edit history. That's a good question. Here's my history. Basically, the way a history works is similar to Photoshop, I believe. It only keeps so many. I'm not sure. I'm not positive about this. This is a really good question. The question is, and really, no, it might be almost infinite. I mean, this list continues to grow. We can see the history grow as I make changes. So I think this just keeps growing. Now, snapshots is different, and we'll talk about those too. But I could go back to any point, and the history in Lightroom is great. Looks like it's saving all of it. I think that answers your question, Al. If not, clarify it just a little bit more. I just want to keep moving. Okay, so I've applied a preset. I'm off to a good start. I'm not blowing out everything. I've got a good balance of information here. A little bit of clipping in the highlights, a little bit in the shadows. Now let's get over and do a quick overview of the develop module. Now, brushes and local adjustments is not something we're going to get into today. That's for another day. But effectively, develop module starts at the basics and kind of works its way down, and on some level you're getting into more intricate stuff the further you go down the list. Not entirely, but it's kind of set up that way so that the things you're going to use the most are at the top. For example, white balance. So if I slide the white balance, it's going to change things around. And white balance does affect a black and white image still, as you can see. Okay? Now, I can also choose white balance settings. This is similar to like we had in the grid mode. I can click the eyedropper. And let me just select a color image real briefly here. Let's say I had a gray card in this image from just outside Death Valley. I can click the eyedropper up here. It'll give me an eyedropper and allow me to select an area. And what it's wanting me to select is a neutral gray. So if I was 100% on the ball, I would have like my little girl standing in there holding a gray card or sitting against the tree or something like that. And then I could set it and stick it there and get perfect white balance just like that. In practicality, usually what I do if I'm trying to get white balance closer is I'll look at a scene and guess what I think is roughly approximately 50% gray, and I'll click on it. And if it looks good, I'll run with it. And if it doesn't, I'll go again and I'll click somewhere else. And the reason I do that is not because a gray target is a bad idea. It's because I have to remember to have it in there, and also because a perfect exact white balance is not always exactly what I want. Sometimes I'll put a gray card in and you'll click it and you'll get that so-called perfect white balance. And a perfect white balance just means that that card that is 50% gray is truly 50% gray in your image. So if you want the color and to be 100% natural, that's what you want to do. But I don't always want that. And no, Matthew, Al is correct. You do not need to reset between trying presets. If I was, just real quick, if I was going through presets on this, I could change it to whatever I want. Bear in mind, and this is particularly with Power Workflow 3, there's the XI series presets, which are designed to leave everything in this area alone, meaning if it's an XI series preset, you know it's leaving your exposure and fill light and blacks and brightness and contrast alone. So it's great for if you've done a grid edit and you say, hey, I want to convert this image over with this preset, but everything else is exactly the way I want it. In the tone section, I'm going to use an XI preset for that. And if you look here, you'll see some of these are noted with XI, which means it leaves those settings alone. So what I'm getting at is a preset will only overwrite what it's defined to overwrite. So if I edit this right here with a preset that says increase the exposure by 2 stops, and it overexposes it, and then I add another preset that changes the tone and the color, but that preset doesn't define what's being changed, the exposure's still there. It only changes what's defined. That's why when I make presets, and you could do these yourself too, in terms of a reset preset, I'll have a preset that resets the image to its raw state without changing the crop. Because Shift-Command-R will reset, but if you've got crops or local adjustments, it'll also reset all those. So any of the header categories in any of my preset collections, you'll see it says click to reset. You can click those at any time, if you're working with an image and it starts to weird out, just click reset and it'll take you right back to the beginning. Yeah, on white balance L, it's looking for, there is a white balance where you actually select a black, a gray, and a white point, and I wish we had that in Lightroom. We don't. That's something I would like to see here. But in this case, and if you mouse over, well, it did a minute ago. It's not saying right now. It says right there, pick a target neutral. So a target neutral generally would be a 50% gray. Or is it, yeah, I believe it's 15. It could be 18% gray, but it's a gray card is what you want to target. But you know what? A lot of times if it's like a wedding, I will click on the wedding dress because it's white. I'm like, white, gray, whatever. And I'll just click on it and see if it comes out good. I'll do it. A lot of times what I'll do, because sometimes it's easier in an image to know what's white versus what's supposed to be gray. Because sometimes a medium gray is not that far from a white. So oftentimes I might click an area in an image that I know is pretty much white, i.e. a wedding dress, and it might make it too cool, but it'll get me close, and then I'll just go up here and I'll dial the slider up and add a little bit of warmth back into it. So I have no rules. People get really fanatical, and there's a ton of tools out there for managing white balance. And admittedly, it's easier if you get your white balance close, but depending on what I'm working on, I'm looking for what looks good, not what is technically a perfect white balance. Just depends on the tone you're trying to set with the image. Okay, so moving on, we get down here into exposure. That's pretty self-explanatory. Basically, up here you have tone corrections like exposure, fill light, blacks. For time purposes, I'm not, and to not confuse people, I'm not going to go over every single slider and describe exactly what it does. I'm going to go over the overview of what the Develop module does. That's what this is Develop Module Essentials. And if anybody has a question on any particular slider or anything that we're doing, just shout out. And L, yeah, that does apply to flash photography. The issue you'll have with a gray card, let's say you put a gray card and you have the bride hold it in one photo and you have a flash and you use it. The gray is still 100% effective, providing the area you're trying to correct is lit the same as the gray card. Meaning, let's say you throw a gray card on the floor, but you're trying to have perfect white balance on a bride's face. Due to light fall off and however you've set up your light, you're probably going to have differences in light from the floor to the bride's face. So this is something I'll run into where a gray card's not always 100% either, because it doesn't always represent all of the image, particularly if you're using a flash, because flashes fall off. So that doesn't mean it's not effective for use with a flash at all. It just means you need to understand that, in terms of positioning and stuff like that, how a gray card works. But a gray card is still a gray card no matter what. And what happens with this eyedropper is it converts the white balance so that the gray is true gray, and everything else in the image follows that, is how a gray card works. Okay, so breezing through the Develop module, exposure, recovery, bringing back some highlights, fill light, bringing back some shadows, black levels, increasing the intensity of your blacks, brightness and contrast, clarity. It's getting close. I just want to look at clarity real quick. Clarity is a cool tool. It defines, it's not the same as sharpening, but what you're going to see with clarity, on a practical level, it's kind of defining edges. And I'm not going to give the scientific specifics of how it works. I don't even know. But on a practical level, it's intensifying edges. So you see if we crank it way up, here's neutral, it's 0, that's the default. Generally, I'll put a little bit of clarity in. And you can see it kind of intensifies the edges and makes it a little bolder. Now, if you go too much with clarity, particularly on portraits, it's too much. You start to get that kind of high-passed Dave Hill, LucasArts look, and sometimes you want that, but clarity, if you crank it up too much, will be too much. Same with negative clarity. Whoops, that's brightness. I remember when negative clarity came out, this was Lightroom 2, I believe, and everybody's like, woo! We have a soft filter in Lightroom. So we'd all just, everybody for a while just went like this. And you still see this with people who really don't know what they're doing. And they just drop it down. Or they do more. And they'd be like, yay, soft filter, check it. And it's really bad. I mean, trust me, if you do a significant negative clarity to like soften things and have like a really nice, soft, glowy feel, anyone who's like at all proficient in Lightroom is going to say amateur because it really is nasty. I mean, let's put it on a portrait. Negative clarity is okay, just don't overdo it. See, on this one, I have a minus 20 negative clarity. That's quite a bit. Anything more than that, I'm going to start saying, I better go into Photoshop if I want to soften more than this. What it'll do is it'll take the edge off in terms of facial details and stuff like that. But you see, if I'm down to 75, now it's kind of doing this weird Oompa Loompa pasty thing. If I go all the way down to 100, it's bad. Now, on the other hand, if I go too high, there's that kind of wild, intense, overly LucasArts-ish kind of thing that really does not fit this scene. So typically, I'll dial back clarity a little bit if it's a portrait and I'm trying to bring a little bit of subtlety and softness into it, but not lose a lot of detail. I'll dial it up a little bit if it's an everyday image. On average, I'd probably run like plus 10, plus 12 clarity on average across the board. But if it's like a black and white or something, for example, let's say this, I've got minus 40 clarity on here because a little bit of intensity is okay and it works for the scene. If I reset this, it would take some of the edge off this image, and I want that little bit of that edge there. Here's a good rule of thumb, though, for Lightroom. If any slider is to plus 100 or minus 100, or wherever that slider goes, if it's all the way to the right or all the way to the left, I don't care what slider it is, you've probably got issues. And you're probably getting artifacts, you're probably overdoing it. I mean, I'm not saying you never ever do it, although I can't think offhand where I've ever had an image that I effectively had 100% to the right or left. It's a balance thing. Typically, if you get over 80% on a slider, you're going to be getting into trouble. Now, okay, with a vignette, maybe if you want a super strong vignette, you're going all the way down to 100. Even then, it still holds true. I mean, should you really be having that intense of a vignette? Matthew says, is negative clarity best applied with an adjustment brush? I wouldn't say there is a best. And yes, you could use it like a softened skim brush. In fact, I don't know if this is in the resources page, but I don't want to get too into brushes now either. But I'll bring up the brushes here real quick. And there's some brushes that I've made that you can actually download for free from my site. And one of them is Skin Soft, which is effectively bringing down clarity and sharpness a little bit, and you can brush it in. So you can certainly do that. There's nothing wrong with being selective on it, particularly if you say, hey, I want to soften up the face a little bit, but I want these trees over here to be real intense and bold. It's real effective for that. Although I have to say, generally, I'm either going up with clarity or down with clarity or leaving it alone on a global scale. Because usually if I'm trying to, let's say it's a portrait and I really want to, let's say I'm doing this portrait and I want to make her face really nice and soft. Generally for that, I'm going into Photoshop and using my Hollywood effects or some kind of a action or something that smooths skin. Because Lightroom does not do blurs well. If you want to get really beautiful, nice, glowing, soft blurs, smooth porcelain skin of varying degrees, again, something that can be easily overdone, but that's one of those things that you really want to go into Photoshop or a similar editor for, because it's not what Lightroom is made for. That's that 5% that Lightroom can't do. Okay? Now moving on. Oops, back to the develop module here. Okay. Here's our vibrance. And let's use a color image for this. Okay. So what vibrance does, vibrance and saturation are similar but different. Vibrance, what it does is it increases intensity of colors and it attempts to kind of leave flesh tones and stuff like that alone. So the idea is if you're on a portrait or something and you want to kind of punch everything else up, use vibrance, because it's going to leave the skin tones alone. Now, that doesn't ring true 100% of the time. Skin tones vary, all that kind of stuff. So you can certainly overdo vibrance. A lot of times I'll use a little bit of both. Now, saturation is just like saturation in Photoshop. It is increasing the intensity of all colors. But you can see the difference here. I cranked up saturation, and her arm is like this nasty orangeness going on. If I increase vibrance, I'm getting a bit of that, but it really is retaining the flesh tones a whole lot better. So it's effectively leaving certain areas alone, but the blues and things like that are still getting really intense. Now, this is still too much, but you get the idea. Okay? Now, another way to do that is to do control channels. And I do channel stuff a lot when I'm making presets because you can do all kinds of magic with channels, and we're going to take a quick look at those as well. All right, so tone curve. So let's do another image, just try and keep it changed up here. This is a tone curve similar to Photoshop. You don't have quite as much power as using a tone curve in Photoshop, but you can click up here and grab points and change it around. This is kind of a sluggish way to do it. It's not smooth and easy like it is in Photoshop. And it shows you kind of your histogram here in the background, just real faded. But the bottom line is you can change the base point to a linear, which is typically what a JPEG would be at, medium contrast, or strong contrast. And you see it's not changing the main curve yet. You're changing the base. Well, my bad, it is changing the main curve. That was a stupid thing to say. But it's changing your starting point. And it's giving you a standard to start from. At that point, you can then go in and change your sliders. So if I go in and it gives you control, this is really powerful because let's say we're in this image, and we say, hey, the highlights are a little bit hot. Well, I can drag the highlights down, and again, it's easy to overdo it, but I can drop down the hottest areas of it and recover some information. Now, yes, you can use highlight recovery and stuff like that up here, but curves gives you a more precise control. If I crank up the highlights, you see it's really blowing these out. But I can back off, and again, usually it's subtle, but I can bring back some highlight information. Now, lights are the lights, but not the highlights. So a lot of times I'll back off. Well, I shouldn't say a lot of times. I go all over the map. Sometimes I'll back off on the highlights and increase the lights to give a vibrance to an image, to kind of make it pop a little bit. Because if you drop the lights down, it really does darken everything. You get that real flat look if you go down too far. Not that you should never drop the lights down. Okay? But sometimes I'll drop down the highlights to avoid blowing things out, and then bring up my lights a little bit to keep things nice and vibrant and sharp. The darks, it's pretty simple. The darks is your darker areas, lighter or darker. So if I go up with them, it's going to flatten things out. And the shadows is the opposite of your highlights. It's the really dark areas. Up, down, up. And you see, and I crank it all the way to 100. It looks terrible because it's trying to recover shadow area that it doesn't have proper information to recover. So again, subtlety is key. And in practicality, shadows is real similar to increasing the black point. There are different ways to achieve similar things. Not that they're exactly the same, but a lot of times you'll get a similar effect. Okay? Al says, how does lights and highlights differ from brightness? It's a really good question. I'm not sure I have a technical answer for it, but it definitely feels different to me. Brightness is a pretty rudimentary tool, and I don't use it a lot. Same with Photoshop. A lot of Photoshop people don't use brightness a lot anymore. Not that it's not a useful tool, but brightness really is increasing the brightness. I guess really how it differs is brightness is increasing the brightness of everything. It's kind of like exposure, although exposure is a little bit different. Brightness, though, is cranking everything up, which we now see is way too much in this case. Lights and highlights, what's cool about curves is you're taking a specific spectrum of the image and controlling it using those channels. And curves is extremely powerful. I mean, if you have my presets and you go through, you'll see I'm doing a lot of tweaking, and I'll sit there and play with curves, sometimes down to specific points. I'll stop and I'll make a preset, and then I'll try it on different images and say, well, okay, what if I put the lights up by 2 points? And I'll spend a lot of time tweaking things, and curves are really powerful. But that's, on a basic level, that's really what it is brightness is changing everything. It's a global thing. Curves is global in the sense that it affects the whole image, but it's only affecting the areas, the tonal areas of the image that you define. Hopefully that makes sense. Okay, so Let's keep on moving down here. Here's the hue saturation layer. Excuse me, not hue saturation, HSL. So hue, saturation, luminance. Now what you have here, and again, in the develop mode, you can expand and collapse any panels you want just with these little arrow keys. You can have them all expanded. You can set preferences so that it only has one open at a time if you're using a small screen and you want to keep it tidy. There's lots of controls for that in terms of organization. And also, you can turn off an individual panel with these buttons here. See how it highlights that? Let's watch. And it disables those settings. That's not the best one to do for this because, here, I'll turn off the split toning, and you'll see it's a pure black and white now. It no longer has that color hue I added to it. So you can turn off any panel at any time, and you don't lose your settings. It keeps it there. So it's a great way to do kind of comparisons. It's also something I use a lot, where I'm like, what did I do to this image? And I'll start turning panels on and off to see which panel is affecting the particular thing I'm looking for, if I don't know. Okay? So in the HSL, and usually I run it in this mode. You can go to all, and it's a big long panel that shows all of them. I generally run it just like this and select an individual one. So hue, let's go to a good image for this. Hue controls the hues of a particular color channel, and this is hugely powerful. We're going to talk about this some more in terms of dynamic range and ways we can manipulate it in the future workshops, because we're just covering the basics today. But you can say, let's say, okay, I got yellows here, and I want to make the yellows more green. I could take the yellow channel and crank it up. And now it's turning my yellows to green. Again, that's way too much, but sometimes subtle. Maybe I want to make the yellows a little more orange. Okay, there we go. Now I'm getting kind of this evenness between these. So let me turn this off and see the difference. I think I just collapsed it. Okay, off. There we go. See, this tree is kind of orange because of the way the light's hitting it. These ones are getting hit harder. They're coming out as more yellow. So what I did in this case is I balanced the yellows and turned the yellows down a little bit more to orange, and actually I kind of like that. This isn't a great image, but it's a good reference point, because what it's doing is it's giving me consistency that I like. Okay, so that is controlling individual channel level color hues. Next is saturation. Same thing. You're going to kind of see this pattern here. You can go through and you can do an enormous amount to an image using these things because it's very specific. You got channels that affect every color. Okay, let's go to this orange because I have a lot of orange. Let's increase the saturation. And let's do it with the yellows as well. It's probably not showing up as much on your end because it's coming over because it's not making a radical change. Let's try this. Okay, now you're seeing a radical change. I just took all the color from red and orange away. The image is almost black and white now. Most of our colors are in the red and orange section. So you can do kind of interesting selective color things with this too. Now, be careful with that because it can come off pretty cheesy. But the channels give you control over specific things. So when I'm working with stuff, I almost always work with channels. If it's a preset, I probably worked with channels in designing the preset. If I go in and I'm tweaking it more, particularly on a fine art shot, I'll go in and tweak the channels even more and say, hey, let's bring a little blue into this sky, and I'll darken just the blue channel down a little bit. Excuse me, that's saturation. Let's add some saturation to the blue, and that takes us to the next step, which is luminance. Same thing. I can control the lightness or darkness of tones using luminance. So maybe I want the yellows to be darker, and that's too much. But you can bring really cool luminance and depth and dimension. Let's say, you know, you got blades of grass and those are green, and you say, okay, bring up the greens and make them a little lighter. So particularly the highlights of those greens. Since the green is being brought up across the board, you'll get like this brightness in the green. And then maybe you'll go back here and you'll say, let's drop the luminance or the brightness effectively of the oranges. Okay, so we're going to darken those up a little bit. Let's drop the luminance of the blue. I do a lot of dropping of the blue, not too much because it's easy to overdo. You'll start getting kind of fringing around trees and stuff if you overdo it. But I'll use blue all the time. See how it's too much? It looks really bad because around those leaves it's not blue if I drop it all the way down to 100. So again, balance is key. Want to keep it looking natural. In this case, it's pretty sensitive to it because of the way the light's hitting these leaves. But without it, let's turn this off and see all the stuff we've changed. Look at how different this image looks. Here's before. hue, saturation, luminance, and here's after. So maybe this isn't exactly how we want it. We could go wherever we wanted to on this, but it's very powerful, and it's something we're going to talk about more in the future. Split toning is how you're going to get things like cross-processing and things like that. You can add split toning and say, okay, on the highlights, I'm going to add a golden hue. And I use this a lot, particularly in color fantasies. And you can control the saturation of that hue. Okay? And what I'm doing now is kind of ugly, because I'm cranking it up quite a bit. But you can see how radically you can change the tone. This is kind of a global overlay of color versus just changing a color channel. So you can say, okay, I'm going to process this whole image, but then I'm going to click here, and you can also click here and select a color. Let's select a golden tone in the shadows. And now we're adding a golden warmth to the shadows. And then let's say, okay, let's add kind of a purple hue to the highlights. Now that's ugly, so I'm going to turn that way down. Better. And again, you just kind of see what we've done. We've added, there's off, which I think I actually like better that way, and there's on. But a lot of times you can add some really cool magic to an image with a little bit of split toning. And a great way to do it is to have it already in presets, because it can be fairly subtle. I mean, in terms of how much of split toning, how intense you want it to be. It's a fairly subtle thing, so it's a great thing to have in presets because you can try out different things. If I make a preset that's doing split toning or something like that, that's doing like a cross process, a lot of it is done with the split toning. Detail is your sharpening. We're not going to get super deep into that today because we're going to run out of time, but your sharpening is something that you're going to want to zoom in to 1:1 so you can see the detail. I have way too much here. Radius is a radius of how many pixels it controls. So play with these. We're going to come back to these and talk about them in more detail later, but sharpening, typically, if I was sharpening, I would say, if I'm doing an average sharp, I would say, 30, 35, and a radius of 1 to 2, and leave the detail alone and the masking alone. What masking does is it's gonna block out kind of the central areas, and it's gonna effectively sharpen more on the edges than in the open in the open spaces. Meaning, if I did a mask, it would not sharpen a lot in these black areas, but along the edges of these trees, it would sharpen a lot. So let's crank this way up and then mask it down. And you can see it's probably pretty subtle on your end, but it changes how the sharpness is. It's more intense along the edges because we masked it out in the main areas, in the open spaces. Okay? Noise reduction. Again, don't overdo it because you'll end up with a pasty image, but if you have noise, a lot of times I'll run an 8-10 noise reduction, even if it's on a clean image, just to get rid of any kind of grain and clutter. But if you got a lot of noise, you might be going up to 30 or 40, but bear in mind, at that point, you are going to start to lose some detail. Lightroom has, in Lightroom 3 particularly, because the Lightroom 3 rendering engine is really good, noise reduction in Lightroom 3 is good. And I did the review on Pro Photo Show of all those different noise reduction programs. It's kind of due for an update, but Lightroom 3 is great, and I don't have to go to those plugins all that often anymore. They do have some advantage in certain areas, but it's really a powerful tool. But you'll see if we crank it all the way up, particularly I'm seeing it on my end, we start to lose information in the details versus having it down. Just going to check the chat real quick. Okay, looking good. All right, so lens corrections, we're not going to get too specific into that. It works very similar to Photoshop. Lens Correct Auto works really well most of the time, where you would actually just click. And I made a preset for it. It's in PW3. You could certainly save out your own preset as well. But you see it just kind of modified the image for some perspective distortion and things like that. Very cool feature that came in Lightroom 3 that I really like. And, of course, you can get in here and get specific with these. Vertical distortion, horizontal, defringing, all that good stuff is right in there. Effects. It's going to be your grain, which I particularly like. I like the organic feel. A little bit of grain, usually 8 to 12. I'll add that into my images a lot because it helps avoid pasty digital feel. It gives a little bit of texture into it, kind of like film. The grain's a really powerful tool to me, but again, I use it sparingly most of the time. And the vignetting, post-crop vignetting. We can add a vignette. Let's go -82 on the vignette. And I'm doing extreme just for illustration, but all these sliders will control the intensity of your vignettes. Okay, camera calibration down here is meant to mimic the settings in your camera. Like in my Canon case, camera faithful, camera landscape, camera neutral. Because when you shoot, if I set my 5D Mark II to shoot it in wrong click, to shoot it in portrait, for example, Lightroom doesn't read that automatically when it comes in. So I can go down here and set these images, and you can also do it to a group. You can also save it in a preset and kind of have this camera calibration profile to get the look. Honestly, I don't use it a lot because I'm using presets anyhow, and the changes it makes are relatively subtle. If I were to change this around, it is making a little bit of difference. And if there's a mode you like, by all means use it. That one's quite a bit. But what's nice about this is you can affect certain areas of an image but while leaving alone the channels, the hue saturation, all that kind of stuff. So if you have a look that kind of works for you, you can even make a custom camera calibration that you might use as a base point for all your images. Okay, so that's the basics of the develop module. I know we streamed through pretty quick, but this is develop module essentials. I didn't want to get too deep into this stuff. Does anybody have any questions? We're about out of time, but we have one more thing, and we're going to look at exporting and watermarks, which shouldn't take very long. We're going to jump in and take a peek at that. But does anybody have any questions on develop module stuff? Al, good question. How is grain different perception-wise from noise? So some would argue it's the same. And it seems kind of ironic that I'm reducing noise and then adding grain, but I am. And let's actually look. I got an image that'll be a good example because it's extreme. Let's take this right here and go to this one. Okay? Here's this photo that was shot at ISO 25,000. And let's go into develop. Huge ISO, tons of noise, but actually, considering how high of ISO it was, not half bad. It's going to take a second to load here. But if we look in here, let's see what I did to it. I've got a little bit of sharpening, 35. Where'd it go? Detail. Sharpening is 35. I only did 20 on the noise reduction. Let's crank it up and see what happens. It's reducing a lot of noise, but we're also losing a huge amount of detail. And that's why I only did 20. I said, okay, I shot this at 25,000. Now I got to live with it. There's going to be some noise in it. The issue is if you take out all this noise, it's blurring everything. But in practicality, what's the difference? Let me turn off detail settings. Okay, this to me is noise. Noise and artifacts are ugly. And this is how I differentiate them. Maybe other people have a different approach. This is the image without any detail settings, and it looks like crud. There's no noise reduction, no sharpening, no nothing. This is what the camera actually produced. And this is what's amazing about Lightroom 3 is how much better it processes than previous versions. Let's turn it back on. And look at how much of this information it cleaned up. It's still noisy, but it got rid of the nasty color noise. It did a great deal to clean this up. Grain is nice. Grain is like an organic texture. And to me, grain is what film is. Now, film could get some nasty stuff in it too, but a really nice film, if you made a portrait and then made a large wall print of it, it would have a nice grain. It wouldn't be weird and blotchy and digitally. It would have a nice, consistent, natural feeling tone. I call it organic just because it feels kind of natural. So let's go in and add some grain. We're at 100%, remember. I've added 10 points of grain. What I'll do, particularly in a noisy image, sometimes I'll add even more grain in because it gives a nice smooth consistency. Whereas the noise and the artifacts might be kind of ugly and weird looking, the grain is more natural feeling, so I'll add that in. Now if I turn grain off, you're not seeing a huge amount of change. You see it changes a little bit. Okay, there's no grain. There's 70 grain. And that's too much. I don't want that much, but there is an element of order to it now that isn't there before. Typically, if I add grain, even on a heavy image like this, I might only be 18 or something like that, just to give a little bit of natural feel to it. So hoping that makes sense, Al. Yeah, I mean, Lightroom 3, the process is way better. In fact, let's look at this. Okay, this is the current process in Lightroom 3, particularly on noisy images. This is huge. It actually allows you to select the old process, because when old images come in, if you have an old catalog that was made in Lightroom 2, it doesn't automatically switch them over for you. You have to tell it, okay, go ahead and change them over. If I switch this right here to the 2003 process, watch what happens. Look at how the quality degrades. Look at how much more noise and crud is in this in the 2003 version. And I could tweak with it more. I could, in the 2003 process, I could reduce my color noise a bit more. I still have the same sliders, but the point is, the 2010 process is radically improved in terms of the quality of the way it processes pixels. Lightroom 3 is worth it just for this, in that never in digital have I seen anything that gets our images looking natural and film-like more than Lightroom 3. I don't think. And that's why I love working here, and I stay in Lightroom as long as possible before going into Photoshop, because it really is a powerful processing engine. Okay, let me go. We can talk. I welcome us chatting a little late, but I want to get through the main stuff here without running over too much. Make sure I fulfill what I committed to. So we've gone over folders, collections, and virtual copies, develop modular essentials, and the power of presets. We could talk about presets more, too. I mean, in terms of how I use presets in workflow, but we kind of talked about that last week. I'll start with a base preset and then go into more creative presets like we were doing just a few minutes ago. Let's look at exporting. Okay, so let's take this image right here, and let's take another image that's actually finished. Here's one from the Grand Canyon that I'm done with. Okay, so what do we see here? Down at the bottom, I made a virtual copy. Oh, that's the one I made earlier. Here's my original RAW. And then I did all the work I could with it in Lightroom. I worked with channels. I did all kinds of stuff. And then I went and finalized it in Photoshop and did burning and dodging and more precision. And actually, there is a lot of difference. Just to show you how much difference. While Lightroom does do most of the work, if you're making a really spectacular piece and you want it to be as good as it can possibly be, there is a heck of a lot you can do in Photoshop. And that's topic for another day, because we could actually have a whole workshop just on burning and dodging. And I'm working on that. Okay, so let's take the main one. By the way, to compare those two, what I did is I selected both down here with Command Select, and then I pressed the C key, and it took me into a side-by-side compare mode, which is cool, because if I were to zoom in, it would take them both in to the exact same point. They're connected to each other, so it's a great way to compare. Okay, let's look at exporting. I'm going to right-click, go to Export, and it's going to open up the export dialog box. In essence, what we're dealing with is everything we've done in Lightroom to this point has not changed our original file. Now, in the case of this one I'm dealing with, it's a PSD. So when I took it into Photoshop, it exported it to Photoshop and saved it back in. But then I may have done more Lightroom adjustments on top of that to finalize it out. So wherever the current status of this image is, exporting is taking that current status and exporting it to a hard drive in this case. You could also put to it DVD. There's different plugins that'll export to different places. Generally, I'm just exporting usually to my desktop, because then I'll take it and put it wherever I want, or to a specific folder if it's for a client. Okay? So in export, I'm going to go here. I can define where it's going. In this case, it's the desktop. I can put it in a subfolder if I want, and it'll create the folder. I can add it back into the catalog, which I don't want to do. Usually that would end up with kind of chaos. If I export, it's leaving Lightroom. I still have my original in Lightroom, but I'm going to take the export copy out. Okay? File naming, I can control how I rename it. You can go to the edit area and define all these parameters for months and days and years. This is kind of stuff that rather than going over every single step, you should really jump in and poke around in this. File settings are important. That's what you're exporting out to. So it could be your original, which in this case would be a PSD. If this was a RAW file, it'd be a RAW. Generally, you're exporting out to a JPEG. The quality setting from 1 to 100 is the quality of a JPEG if you're set to JPEG. So usually if I'm posting it to my blog or something, I'm going to go 85 or 90. Internet is pretty good these days. I'll keep it up there. sRGB is typically what you'll export with, because it's universally viewable more so than the other ones. sRGB has a little bit less color information than Adobe RGB and ProPhoto RGB, which is why if I'm opening in Photoshop, it's going to stay in one of the other modes like Adobe RGB. But when we're exporting like for the web or to give to a client, you want kind of a standard, and sRGB is more of a standard. So again, I'm doing that last. Resize to fit is if you want to resize. If this isn't checked, it'll export full resolution. Resize, and usually I'll go by long edge and say the longest edge should be 1,000 pixels. If I was exporting for a blog or something like that, I would use that. Sharpen for screen is a little final output sharpening. And I will a lot of times leave this on screen sharpening standard if I'm going to the web. If I'm going to print, I usually export exactly what I want, and I may prep it a little bit in Photoshop before I print it. But for exporting for web, I'll usually go out here and work with this a little bit. Just give a little bit extra sharpening, because when you upload it, they're seeing it small, so it gives it a little bit more pop when it goes on the screen. Okay? Watermarking. Can do that too, and I'm going to come back to that in just a second. Well, I guess we're there. Okay. So let's look at watermarking. You could do a simple copyright watermark. Let's go down here. This is cool in Lightroom 3 because it used to be that this was not here. All you could do was this cruddy kind of overlay. Checking questions real quick here. Everything's looking good? Okay. So I'm going to go to watermark right here and edit watermark. And you see I've saved some presets. And we'll come to those in a minute. Okay, it's going to bring up my edit watermark window. What's going on? Whoops, I'm a little lost here. Matthew says sharpening versus export sharpening. They're both sharpening. As far as I know, there's no technical difference in what it's doing. The thing about export sharpening is it gives you some control over, you know, this image may look the way you want it, but if you're going to web, a lot of times you want to, if you're going to a screen, depending on where you're sending it, you may want a little extra sharpening. Particularly if you're uploading it to the internet, because that little extra sharpening will make it pop a little bit. Sometimes you may see, you'll go to somebody's site and all their images seem super vivid and sharp on the screen. They've probably done some export sharpening specifically for that one, whereas an image for print you might not sharpen as much as you would in export sharpening, because the export is so small you might want to sharpen it a little bit more. So yes, you could do that with virtual copies, or you could say, here's my final image, and then I'm going to export it, and I'm going to add a little boost of sharpening on top of that. And Al says, how do you get the real copyright symbol in a watermark? And let's look at that. Okay, so here is the watermark editor in Lightroom 3, which is much improved over Lightroom 2. And there's a plugin I use for watermarks called Lightroom Mogrify. I really like it. It does essentially what this does, but it gives you more power. And it's in the resources pack in my list. There's a link to it in there. Lightroom Mogrify. It's by Timothy Arnaz. I use that for all my watermarking because it does more than this. You know, you can have one watermark in one corner and your name in another corner. You can do anything you want with Mogrify. But essentially, the concept of it is similar to this. So we're going to look at this since this is specifically Lightroom features we're looking at today. Okay, so what do we have? This one is just saying copyright Gavin Seim. It's the text I put down here. Okay, so I could change this to whatever I want. Copyright I rule Lightroom. That'd be a weird thing. It's kind of punk rockish looking, but you get the idea. Let's change that back. Okay, so that's what it would put. Now what I'm seeing here is I can say control where I want it. Okay, I can make an anchor point, right corner, upper left, middle. I can put this copyright wherever I want. My opinion is putting a copyright in the middle of a photo is a good way to completely distract from a beautiful photo. I guess this is a topic for another day, but I know we don't want people stealing our images, but to me, this totally takes away from what I'm trying to see. But in any case, I'm going to put it in the bottom right, and then I can say inset, put some padding, really nice interface on this. So it's not right to the edge. I can drag the corners if I want and make it larger or smaller. Okay? I can control the opacity of it. And this interface is pretty self-explanatory. I can say size it proportionally to the image, fit to the image, or fill the image. That's another way to do it. Proportionally is typically how I would do it. I'm guessing this is percentage. No, not quite. But this is a consistent proportional scale that should stay pretty even throughout your images, okay? Now, there is a basic text watermark. Up here, we could go and say, I want an image. So I could browse to an image file like my logo or my signature, and I could put it in there, define all these parameters, and save it out, and voila, I would have my signature in the corner. And then what I can do, and what you can do with any of these, is save the current settings as a preset. We talked about presets earlier. Presets are all throughout Lightroom, and we're going to talk about them more in the future on other workshops. You can save presets of almost anything, including an individual preset for exporting, a preset for how you want to do your watermark. You can have presets for anything you want. In this case, I already have a preset for my signature. It's called Silver Sig. Okay, so what's it doing? It's taking the image I chose, which is a PNG of my signature, and I'm going to make it a little larger. And I've got no inset. There's a little padding on the image itself, but I'm going to put a little inset in here, a little bit of space. Opacity, I'm going to leave it full. I can change proportion here too without actually dragging it. And I've got it in the bottom right corner. Okay? So when I'm done, I can save those settings. And when I'm exporting, I just select what settings I want to use. So in the watermarking tab, I'm going to say Silver Sig. And let's set resize for long edge of 1,000 pixels. It's going to the desktop. And hit the export button. Now it's going to take just a second. It shouldn't be long. Al, the copyright symbol was in there by default. But the copyright, it depends on your computer. I mean, all computers have usually a symbols list somewhere. My little trick, which is kind of goofy, but if I'm writing something and I want an actual symbol like trademark, TM, or copyright or something like that, I'll just Google like copyright symbol, because it is just a text character. So it'll just come up in a Google search, and I'll just select it and copy and paste it into whatever I'm doing. But you can just bear in mind a basic copyright symbol. I mean, you can make an image in Photoshop to overlay all that good stuff, but a basic copyright symbol is a text, and it's a standard text character. Okay, so here it is right here. Here's the image. It's a little small, but you get the idea. My signature's right in the corner. Honestly, most of the time, if you look on my blog, like f164.com, my fine art stuff, I don't want distractions on it. And I don't make them super huge. They're about 1,000 pixel images, but I want them to look big and beautiful and just have my signature and stay classy. And that's usually about all I do. And sometimes, sometimes with weddings or something like that, I might have Seim Studios in the corner or something. You can go as far as you want, but generally I just put a signature. So, okay, let's go again. Let's say, here's presets. Here's presets I've made. Signature 800, let's call this. So I've named all these presets, and you can see as I click these, it's changing all these settings around. So anything I define over here, I can then add a preset right here and save those settings as a preset so I can come back to them anytime I want. So what you'll do is it takes a while to get everything set up, but you'll say, okay, what do I need for blogs? What do I need for Facebook? What do I need for a client disk? Get all those set up, get your logos on them, anything you need, and you will save yourself a huge amount of time, because then all you'll have to do is come in here, click what you want, click export. And sometimes you may modify the parameters or where it's going, but that's all there is to it. You'll just export it, and boom, bang, it's all done. Now, cool thing too, if you right click and go to export, your presets show up right here. You don't even have to open the export module. So if I want to export SSArt 1024, which is what I use if I'm posting to f164.com, I literally just go to export, click this, and as long as the specified destination is where I want, which in this case is going to be the desktop, as long as I don't need to modify it, because to do that I would have to actually open the export dialog box. But if I'm using this preset as is, I just click it and boom, I've just exported that image. I can continue working. We see up here it's exporting and doing its thing. But I can just move on down the road. So I might say, okay, let's take these 10, get those exported into the desktop for my blog, and then just keep working. Okay? So here's this one. Now, this one was done using Mogrify. Like I said, I like Mogrify, so that's what my presets are saved with, but it's doing effectively the same thing. Mogrify is cool because if you look close here, there's actually a stroke around this. So Mogrify, you can actually define borders and stuff like that. That's why I like the Mogrify plugin. It's just the level of control it gives me. Here's this one. So we're just putting a signature in the corner. This right here is how I would upload to F164. 1,000 pixel image with a signature. That's it. Okay. Looking for questions. Okay, perfect. So that is the overview of the development module. I know we covered a lot of this stuff pretty quickly, and this was everyday Lightroom. This isn't super advanced stuff we're getting into, but questions. Let's talk. We're actually out of time, so if you have to leave, go for it. We have covered everything, but I welcome discussing it. So Bob says, excuse me, Barb, sorry, looking at that wrong. Do you have to use only images shot in RAW, or can you do this to JPEGs? Yeah, everything we've done today, you can do to JPEGs as well. Now, sometimes JPEGs take settings a little differently, which is why, for example, in Power Workflow 3, I have a JPEG set of presets and a RAW set of presets. But in terms of everything you can do, like changing settings, exporting, putting watermarks, Lightroom doesn't care what the file is. It still doesn't change the original file. The file's not treated any differently. I mean, you can make collections and virtual copies and export and all that good stuff, just like if you were working with a RAW file. Now, you should work with raw files. Raw files give you more information. So if you are using JPEGs, you're throwing information away. And generally, I don't see a need to use JPEGs unless you're doing sports or something and you have to be super fast on your frame rate, because you really do lose a lot if you shoot JPEG. But sometimes you're still dealing with JPEGs. Maybe you have a copy you've saved out that you're editing or something like that. But if you go, for example, to edit in Photoshop, it would open it as a TIFF or a PSD, not a JPEG. And that way you can keep it in a 16-bit and a higher quality, lossless, uncompressed format, because JPEG throws away information. Okay. Yeah, same with TIFF. PNG, I think I tried to import a PNG the other day and it didn't read it. So it recognizes PNGs for, maybe it was the type of PNG it was. That's something good to try. I don't save artwork type stuff in PNGs. It definitely will recognize a PNG if you're overlaying something like a signature, so in terms of export modules and things like that. But I'm not sure if Lightroom will actually see a PNG. It may depend on the PNG format. It could have been a PNG 24 I was trying to work with, and that might have screwed it up. Hey, if anybody's in the GoToWebinar control panel, our chat room is over at seimfx.com/chat. So if you're not in there, head over there. And also, if anybody wants to get on the audio right now and ask a question in real time, you can raise your hand in your GoToWebinar control panel. And you can also head over to seimfx.com/chat to join the little discussion over here and our after workshop questions. So that concludes the essentials. Honestly, we had to work a little faster than last week because this was actually quite a bit of information to cover. And we went over a lot of stuff today. So anybody have any questions? Anything that you want to discuss? Anything we need to clarify? Because I'll totally hang out for a few minutes and cover this, and we'll go over whatever you guys want. Any questions at all? Thanks, Kelvin. I'm glad you got something out of it. I hope the workshop experience was all right. I'm trying to refine this. It's not always easy to do everything over online, and that's why I'm adding notes and stuff and tips on how to better manage and interact and stuff with the workshop. Try and keep everything rolling as smoothly as possible. We had a few technical issues, and we had less this time, so that's great. Al, on the recording, let's see. I did record this before. Officially, no recordings are with this, and I'm working on a series of recorded stuff to have on the site too, and I'm experimenting with my recordings to see how I want to do it. Probably I'm actually going to record it separately without a panel so I can focus and not be dealing with interfaces and chat rooms and stuff like that. But officially, there is no recording. If this recording comes out and I can make it good, last week I was able to email you guys a recording. Those of you that were here last week got an email about that. And great, Bob. I'm glad there was no dropouts. But if I get a good recording, I'll share it with you. Just don't spread it around, because I mean, I'm probably going to want to do a series of recordings that's actually professionally put together. And you guys were here, so the chaos that's going on with chat rooms and stuff makes sense to you. But it's it's something that's just for the workshop attendees. But yes, I will. If I come up with a good recording, I will send an email to everyone who attended today, and so that you can watch it. And as far as I know, it worked fine last week. So as long as I get a decent recording, that's fine. But no guarantees. And as far in terms of essentials, email me, Al, and I will see what I can work out for you. And Barb, if you got the email, it had a link directly to the video. So I'm not sure why you would have a problem downloading it. If you clicked that link, it would open it directly in a browser. And if you typically, I don't know if you're Mac or PC, but usually if you right-clicked the link, you could save the video, for example, to your desktop. So there's no reason that I know of why it wouldn't work. Maybe I'll put it in a zip file this week to make it simpler for people, and just have everybody download. But if you're on a PC and you're having issues, it could be maybe you don't have QuickTime installed because it wasn't H.264 format video. So if you don't have QuickTime installed, that's free. Go get that on your computer, and hopefully that'll help. And if you still have issues, you're welcome to email me. If anybody have issues, okay, you did right click and it couldn't download it. I'm not sure. I'll have to check. I mean, the file's there. People were downloading it, so I'm thinking you're doing something wrong, but I could be mistaken. I know I will be deleting the file in a few days. I put it on a temporary area, so anybody that wants it that attended last week's class should check that out. But good. You were able to view it. Okay, it must. We'll have to look into that. Thanks you, Al. I'm glad you enjoyed it, and it's amazing what you can do in Lightroom. It really does, and especially when you start getting into channels. I get really excited and kind of giddy when I talk about channels, and sometimes maybe I bore people because we can actually go way deeper into channels, and we will in some of the later workshops. It's a huge thing, and channels and burn and dodge. Those two things are my huge thing. I mean, those are like the super secret sauce that I use in a lot of my images, particularly burn and dodge. But I start with channels and getting everything looking good, and then I'll go in and you can work absolute magic with burn and dodge. And Lightroom's burn and dodge is limited. It's useful, but it's limited. But you get into burn and dodge in Photoshop, and you can absolutely transform an image.